Well, thanks for joining us today on this next video in this series. We've been talking about how do we work with children with trauma in the classroom, and how do we take some new information and how do we apply that and have better interactions with our students. And so this video, what we want to talk about is how we communicate as humans. We want to talk about how it is that not just through words, but through other means we communicate with each other, because this is a really critical component. When we have an emotional interaction and we share emotions, why is it that we do that? What's the significance of that? And so we want to talk today in this about, especially as teachers, this is really vital that we learn to listen and we learn to see and hear and feel the way our kids communicate with us.
So I would tell you that, like, my first year of teaching, I would agree that, yeah, behavior is communication. And going into my classroom, I thought that, I believed that. Yep, behavior is communication. But I don't know that I always recognized what I was seeing as a means of communication, especially the bigger behaviors. To me, they maybe felt manipulative, or I felt like I was being taken advantage of by students. I can tell you in one particular story where I learned quite a bit about this behavior as communication idea. I had a student in my classroom, and his name was Benjamin, we'll call him. Benjamin had been doing work all along. He was a middle student. I mean, he wasn't a high achiever, low achiever. He always just got the minimum done. And so we had started the week before open house trying to create a bunch of art projects and things like that, because we all like on open house to display all these things for parents. Well, as we were doing each project, he either refused to do them, he started acting out in class, he would rip up papers, he would end up being sent out of the classroom because of his communication with me at the time. And I felt like he was just trying to get out of doing work. About the day before open house, I had sent him out of the classroom because he had actually hit another student. And I stood with him outside and I just said, "Benjamin, what is going on? Can you please tell me, why are you not wanting to do your work? You seem really angry. I can tell." And I kind of like lined out all the things. And I'm doing this and I'm very eye level with him. And he looked at me and he said, "Why would I do that stupid work? My parents have never come to open house." And right in that moment, I recognized, like, his behaviors were not trying to manipulate me. His behaviors were communicating to me that he was very hurting. He was a hurting kid, and that he didn't want to be failed one more time by someone not coming to see the work he had done. And so me giving him work to do was kind of a trigger for him to feel like no one loved him or cared about him. And so when we talk about behaviors communication, we're even talking about the big, scary behaviors where you maybe feel a little manipulated. And so we're going to go into that and talk about what the brain is doing and what that looks like in our students, and even how we respond in our behaviors and what we're communicating to our students.
So we want to talk about what we call the 7-38-55 rule. And the 7-38-55 rule is not something we developed, but Dr. Morabian was a guy who studied communication in humans years ago, and he did a lot of writing on this, a lot of research. And so you might guess, when we talk about communication and we talk about how lots of communication is nonverbal, so the 7-38-55 rule breaks down like this. And when we're dealing with emotional context and we're sharing emotions, that sort of thing, this is not when we're just talking about the weather or just general things, but when we're having emotional conversations, 7% of meaning is derived from the words that are said, 38% comes from tone of voice, and 55% comes from body language. And so what that tells us right away is that when we are having a conversation with somebody and we're sharing emotions, the vast majority of the conversation, what's being conveyed and received, is not from the words that we are saying. And so, you hear that a lot. 80% of communication is nonverbal. And this is actually the scientific study that showed that this is actually true. And so when we use words, when we're dealing with our students in a classroom and we're just using our verbal skills and using words. Sometimes they're not really listening to the words that we're saying. They're watching our face and watching our body language and listening as we change the cadence of our voice, as we change the tone of our voice, and we become more stern, or it's funny when we see people that are around babies and they interact with a baby, there's always this higher pitched voice that comes out, and people talk in a certain way when they're communicating to a baby. And that, I think, is just something that we kind of innately do. It's a way we communicate with them. And so as children, as they come into our classroom as students, if we can focus on this idea that when we need to convey meaning to our students, we need to convey meaning here much more than here. The focus needs not be on the words exactly that we say, but on how we say them and our body language. And so we'll talk a little bit more as the video goes on about some of the specific body language issues we have. But this 738 rule is a real fundamental principle in understanding the way that we communicate.
And so one of the things I think that's really important is that we go back and we look at how we've learned to communicate in the first place. And if you think about a newborn baby and we think about the attachment process, this is how we are actually learning how to understand the world and learn to communicate. We have what are called mirror neurons. And so if you watch a mom and a baby, or you watch a newborn with an adult, they'll actually mimic. Whether mom sticks her tongue out, a newborn baby will stick their tongue out. You know, as a baby gets older, we make goofy faces, and the baby's going to make those faces back to us. And those are those mirror neurons, and it's like a monkey see, monkey do. Well, we're learning all about this communication through that. And so when we think about kids from hard places, we think about this attachment process, right? Where a child or a baby expresses a need. The need is read and interpreted by a secure base, or the mother, and then the need then is met. And so we have this complete circle that happens. Well, kids from hard places, we see areas where this is broken. It's either the baby or the child expresses a need and a secure base does not recognize the need, or if the secure base recognizes the need, when the need is met, the child cannot receive it because they're having processing difficulties. And you're going to see this in your classroom. And what this looks like is a very thin emotional margin and a child who's not going to act their chronological age. And so just like Darren mentioned earlier, we tend to have a higher pitched voice with a baby or a child, and we act silly. Well, if you watch a child who is expressing a behavior, their behavior is subconsciously driven when it's a scary behavior, or a behavior like lying, rage, anger, flipping a desk, those things. Those are subconsciously driven. And so you are going to, if the next time you see this, if you step back for a moment and you watch the child, what you're going to recognize is they're actually working out of the basement of that brain. They're actually working and communicating to you from the basement of their brain. So they might have a higher pitched voice. Their gross motor skills are not going to be what is typical for their chronological age. And they're also going to be making decisions and choices that don't match their chronological age. And just like we said in prior videos, in that moment you need to teach to the emotional age of the child. And so when we are looking at communication and we understand that your words don't mean anything in that moment, or very little, then you are going to start learning to communicate to the child through body language and through tone of voice. And so your body language and tone of voice need to be matching the emotional age of the child. That does not mean that you're going to go goo goo gaga with this child, but you are going to lower the tone of your voice. You're going to have a regular cadence and rhythm, and that you're also going to get your body posture so it is not in a threatening place for a child. And that might be lowering yourself to the floor and being on level with the child. And then you're going to do what is called holding the space. And holding the space is you're sitting in the moment and you are using what are these vibrations that we give off, these external vibrations of calmness that we automatically are giving off to kids or to people around us to help regulate the child in that moment.
Yeah. I think it's interesting, you after you are in a classroom for a while and you start to pay attention to the way kids communicate, you see a lot of these things are true. And so when we have, as human beings, we have this need to emotionally connect. And so when we have a conversation and we express our emotions, what's the purpose of this, right? Why is it that one person shares emotions with somebody else? And why do we take to heart someone else's emotions? Well, it's because emotions, when we communicate our emotions, it helps us to stay grounded in the moment. And it helps us to stay connected to each other. And so here's an example of how in a classroom I can communicate something non-verbally to a student that I wouldn't want to communicate. So if in a classroom I'm lecturing, let's say, and a student raises their hand, they put their hand up and they have a question they want to ask, and it's pretty obvious, the whole class knows his hand's up. I see him, I see the hand is up, but I just continue to teach and I don't acknowledge them. I look at them and I just keep on right on going. And their hands, eventually starts waving and they're trying to get my attention because they want to make a comment or they want to ask a question, and I ignore them. If I ignore them and I don't address them, eventually what'll happen, probably that hand's going to go down. And then what do you see in that person? Well, you see rejection. You see them probably fold their arms and they're going to check out emotionally. They're going to become distant from me because what I'm communicating to them is sort of, I don't have time for you, or I'm not really interested in answering your question, or I don't care what you have to say. Those are the things being communicated to that child that I really don't intend to communicate to them. And so the opposite would be true as somebody raises their hand and I say to them, hey, I see your hand is up and I appreciate you want to ask a question. I'll come back to you in just a minute. Real simple way of approaching a communication that when we understand what our nonverbal communication is going to do to a child. And as Stacy said, kids that have trauma in their background, this is probably even more skewed towards tone of voice and body language than in people who are maybe have those healthy attachments. And so one other thing we got to pay attention to when we talk body language and words, everybody kind of knows the old, they make memes and things out of it now. It's been on lots of TV shows. People will say, I'm fine. And it's fine. Everything is fine. And what that really means is it's definitely not fine. And
so anytime I come home and he asks how my day was and I say, it's fine. I think every man across America can resonate with the fact that maybe it's not fine.
It's not fine. It's not fine. The words don't really convey the meaning that they are. So when we text, we lose a lot of meaning, right? Because we created a whole series of emoticons and emojis to convey what did we really mean when we typed out these words. And that's because inherently we are driven to pick up on nonverbal cues. And so what we watch when we talk with kids, we do this as parents, we do this as educators in the classroom. When a student communicates, you ask them a question, did you break that in my room? And the word they're going to always say is going to be probably no. They're going to say no. But you watch their body language and they'll say no, or they'll say it unconvincingly, or they will give off cues that tell you that the word is not being congruent with their body language. And so what Dr. Morabian in his studies found was that for significance to be conveyed, body language, tone of voice, and words all need to be congruent. They need to match up. And so words said in the wrong tone of voice or that didn't match up with the body language, you're going to lose some significance in the communication. And so when a child is lying to you, they will have probably signs in their body that they are lying, or when they're restless, or if they're hyperactive, or if they're doing all these behaviors, those are ways that they're communicating things. And so their words might say, no, I'm fine, everything's fine, or, how are things at home, you might ask them, and they say, oh, no, everything's great. But then you see their behaviors in a classroom and that's most likely not true.
I think one of the most important things to think about this is, when a baby cries, we don't get frustrated and say, oh, I keep having to meet this child's need. Why do I keep having to pick this baby up or feed this baby or do these things? What I think is super important is that we need to recognize, when did we stop thinking that expressed needs needed to be met, not just disciplined? Because what we tend to do is we tend to discipline or punish a behavior when it's actually there's an underlying need. And we're going to go more into that in the next video because we're going to give you a ton of applications in video 5. And we're going to talk about holding the space, and we're going to talk about how you relate to these kids in a different way. But I want you right now to really think about when we see behaviors in our classroom, we tend to want to isolate the behaviors, whether the student is sent to walk a track, whether the student is sent to go sit somewhere else or sent to the principal's office. We tend to move to what we call isolation in order to punish or discipline a behavior that we see. And that is actually the absolute worst thing that you can do for a child from trauma, because they already have an inner narrative that tells them how worthless they are, how stupid they are, and how unlovable they are. And so we need to look at, and we're going to talk about this in video 5, of the ways to change our language, the ways to change our communication with our students so we are communicating in a way with them where all of it is congruent, our language, our body, and our tone is all matching to help change that internal voice within them that's telling them they're not worthy and lovable.
I think it's real critical. One kind of last component to this is to understand the difference between conscious and unconscious behavior. And subconscious behavior is really vital. And so what we're doing is we're saying we can take our subconscious body language and maybe tone of voice, the things that we do naturally that we're not really paying attention to when we communicate. And we're saying let's bring them to the front part of our brain when we communicate and actually bring them into our conscious thought, so that I know when I'm communicating to a student, I'm going to really focus on my body language and on my tone of voice. My facial expressions, are my eyebrows down, is my forehead furrowed, am I frowning, smiling, are my eyes big? All of those things are because the child, the student, is subconsciously focusing on those. The words are going in, but we all know sometimes it's like the words go in and they go right back out. But the meaning of what you're saying is going to be conveyed. And so if you are stern or you are angry or you are out of control because you were made upset because of a behavior in your classroom, that's going to convey a lot to a student. And so just remember that you're going to consciously work on using those subconscious cues to communicate really important things to your students. It'll make a huge difference. We talk a lot in schools about de-escalation techniques when there's a conflict in a classroom. Well, this is a absolutely huge component of de-escalation when it comes to our students. So in the next video, we're going to talk about how do we take kind of this knowledge of how the brain works, how we communicate and perceive things, and then how do we really use it in real concrete ways in our classroom. So that's the direction that we want to head.